The earliest Greek colony in the West, Pythiakusa, was founded around 773 BC on an island in the Bay of Naples. The Greeks called such settlements an apoikiai, literally an away home. It's worth noting that this was not like the later Roman Colonia, which was imposed as an outpost of the empire, but rather a new and independent polis established overseas. That date signifies more than just a founding. It marks the beginning of a transformation as Greece extended its city form far beyond the Aegean. Colonization, for the Greeks, was a structured process. Rules were established, rights agreed upon, legitimacy ensured, a process akin to a written contract rather than an improvised venture. We will explore how these away homes balanced autonomy with a remembrance of their origins through ritual, law, and tradition. Stay with me, and you'll see how ritual, charters, and oracle advice transformed risky voyages into stable new city-states. But first, we need to understand the powerful forces that compelled families to leave their land behind entirely. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we begin, just a quick housekeeping note. If you enjoy what I'm doing, a like and subscribe would be really helpful. It goes a long way in keeping the channel going. And don't forget to drop a comment. I'd really love to know what you think. In the mid-8th century BC, entire communities faced choices that would shape the Greek world for generations to come. Colonization was not a random occurrence. It was part of a broader movement that tradition dates to around 750 BC, with the earliest foundations, such as Pythiakusa, marking its start. When questioning why Greeks left their homeland, evidence consistently points to three main drivers. First, land hunger and population pressure. Second, opportunities for commerce and trade. And third, exile or the restless ambitions of adventurous individuals. The strongest motivation came from the farms themselves. As families grew, land was divided repeatedly until plots became too small to sustain a household. Subsistence farming could not keep up with the number of mouths that needed to be fed, and inheritance rules meant that each generation worked the soil that shrank with every division. Agriculture was not just an occupation, it was central to survival and civic identity. Without sufficient farmland, a household faced decline, and with growth pressing constantly, this created a mounting crisis. Land hunger was not a case of sporadic bad luck. It was a structural problem deeply ingrained in Greek society. Nevertheless, turning away from fields to the sea was no simple fix. The Mediterranean promised both danger and opportunity. The poet Hesiod reminds us that the Greeks feared the sea with good reason. Their ships were fragile, storms were sudden, and losses were often irretrievable. Most preferred to remain on land rather than trust an unreliable horizon. Yet, when land could no longer expand, the perilous water route became the only option available. It was never a straightforward choice between security and risk, but between two stark dangers: hunger at home or the storms abroad. Additional motives are layered onto this. Trade was highly appealing. The placement of many colonies at good harbors or crossroads of exchange is no coincidence. It reflects deliberate planning to expand markets and secure supplies. For merchants and artisans, establishing a settlement was less about survival through farming and more about connecting networks, funneling grain, metals, or textiles into the circuits of exchange. These ventures helped establish the colonies as vital nodes in Mediterranean commerce. Exile added a new dimension. Greek politics at this stage was divided, and when rival factions lost local struggles, banishment was often the result of defeat. Leaders forced out, or their followers fearing reprisals, turned necessity into a foundation. For them, leaving was less a matter of voluntary exploration and more a compelled migration. Alongside them came individuals driven by ambition, men who saw colonization as the chance to claim land, create wealth, or live free of former ties. Each of these motives meant that the reasons aboard a ship were rarely the same. Imagine a vessel setting out from the Aegean. On its benches sat farmers whose fields could no longer support them, merchants plotting trade routes, men escaping political enemies, and others simply lured by adventure. Each group carried different expectations of what lay ahead. The diversity of motive shaped the character of every colony. Some focused on agriculture, others on trade, and some became refugees for exiles. You don't find a single pattern repeated city by city. Instead, you see variations grounded in the mixed reasons that prompted each expedition. But leaving was not just about solving problems or seeking opportunities. It was about facing immense uncertainty. Each settler knew the journey risked shipwreck, disease, resistance from local populations, and perhaps never seeing their homeland again. For the poor farmer wondering about new land, the lure was the prospect of children inheriting fields that could support them and their families. For the banished politician, it was a matter of survival against enemies. For the trader, it was profit and connections. Colonization combined all these hopes and pressures into a single, risky voyage. Given such a wide range of motives, you might imagine disputes erupting once a ship landed, and without structure, they easily could have. New settlements needed more than enthusiasm to sustain them. They required clear order. Rules for land distribution, leadership, worship, and protection had to be established from the outset. Otherwise, differences would quickly threaten fragile beginnings. Greek colonization demonstrates how people transformed competing aims into lasting institutions. That is where ritual and planning came into play. These expeditions were not haphazard gatherings of desperate families. Before setting out, mother cities appointed leaders, established terms, and sought divine approval. Agreements created shared rules for the group. With charters prepared beforehand, disputes over farming plots or authority were less likely to split the settlers upon arrival. Colonization was presented more as an organized act rather than a spontaneous one, ensuring consistency across widely dispersed settlements. This approach balanced risk with legitimacy. Settlers were more inclined to follow orders when they perceived leadership as authorized both by their mother city and divine will. The order was not only practical, but also symbolic, as it transformed exiles, traders, and farmers into members of a single civic community. Rituals infused the venture with seriousness, turning risky journeys into socially recognized acts of expansion. What could have been vulnerable camps of strangers instead became established communities, though fragile. The impact was significant. Colonies might focus on trade, farming, or refuge, but all bore the mark of a deliberate process. This meant that departing from home did not resemble aimless wandering. It followed the pattern of a civic foundation, conducted with rules, titles, and divine references. Each new settlement could trace its legitimacy back to these origins, linking scattered groups into a broader Hellenic identity while preserving local differences. Reflect again on the image of migrants boarding their ships, not a mass of households fleeing chaos, but people bound by a charter, carrying a framework strong enough to shape them into a polis wherever they landed. The act of departure contained both desperation and purpose. Necessity drove them out, while structure ensured they arrived as something more than displaced groups. And at the core of this framework stood one vital figure. His role was both practical and symbolic, and his name carried significance long after the voyages concluded. To understand how fragile expeditions became enduring cities, we need to meet the person who embodied their risks and provided them with order: the Oikístes. Every Greek settlement abroad carried the memory of a single leader whose name endured long after his lifetime. This was the Oikístes, the founder, appointed to guide people across seas and into new lands. Unlike other settlers, he was not simply a farmer seeking soil or a merchant eyeing new markets. He represented the organizing principle of the entire venture, embodying the authority of the metropolis while acting as guarantor of order abroad. Colonists might disagree on many issues, but they found structure around his role. The appointment of the Oikístes was deliberate. He did not emerge by chance, but was chosen from the mother city. Evidence suggests he was often a man of status, usually aristocratic, but not necessarily the most powerful figure at home. This balance was crucial. He held enough authority to command respect, but being outside the dominant faction made him a more trustworthy choice for the uncertain task. Through him, the settlement carried legitimacy, appearing as an authorized extension of civic order rather than a group of dispossessed wanderers. This meant his success or failure was intensely significant. If the colony thrived, his name would live on as its founding ancestor, woven into the ritual memory. Descendants talked of him much as they did of a heroic forebear, linking the colony's story with his own. But if disaster struck the colony, famine, defeats, or mismanagement, his name also bore the blame. Even in death, he remained the point against which fortune shifted, both honor and disgrace refusing to fade. Leadership in this context involved continuous evaluation, with reputation bound to the community's outcome. His tasks were as practical as they were symbolic. Before a vessel set sail, the Oikístes completed a crucial sequence. In spoken form, you can think of it as a mental checklist: obtain metropolis approval, consult Delphi, draft the charter and divide the land, recruit, and lead the first voyage. Each step was essential. Civic approval provided political backing. The Oracle offered divine endorsement. The charter established legal order, and recruitment supplied the necessary workforce for survival. Only after this chain was complete could a fleet leave, carrying both settlers and a framework of trust. Consulting the Delphi-anchored belief. Without the authority of Apollo's voice, conflict could erupt before departure. The charter, in turn, was more than administration. It was a constitution designed in advance, promising every settler a defined share of land and a secure role in civic structure. It circumvented quarrels by setting rules before uncertainty could split the group, and by recruiting openly, often at great festivals where Greeks gathered from across regions. The Oikístes transformed an uncertain gamble into a promising invitation, a chance at land and standing in return for trust in a structured plan. If this sounds like projecting a model outward, that is correct. In some ways, the Oikístes functioned like a representative sent by a parent organization to establish a branch abroad. He carried the values of the original polis, but understood he had to adapt them to a new setting. Success meant fusing metropolitan identity with local reality. His legitimacy ensured that settlers saw continuity with their homeland, and his planning allowed the new settlement to develop its own stability from the outset. Because of this, his figure loomed long after ships had landed and streets had been laid. Colonies were designed to be self-governing in practice, not eternally ruled by their founder. His role was initially concentrated, but it was ritualized by memory. Many colonies maintained their tombs, shrines, or cults as focal points of identity. In certain places, he became a civic ancestor, honored with offerings as though he had crossed the threshold into hero status. This was not heroism in the mythical sense, but through his embedding of order into the city's birth. Honoring him preserved community cohesion and legitimized institutions across generations. Significantly, the form of the Oikístes' duties varied. Some found themselves negotiating with local populations, others concentrating on distributing land or drafting civic schemes. The extent of his responsibilities shifted according to circumstance, but one constant governed them all. His authority arose through procedure. He was never simply a charismatic figure imposing control. He was appointed, confirmed, and sanctioned by rituals and laws that all settlers recognized. This ritualized foundation prevented rivals from contesting his role, even amid diverse and occasionally hostile groups of migrants. That consensus mattered to survival. Merchant families, exiles fleeing factional strife, and farmers desperate for soil could easily clash. The Oikístes converted these competing motives into cooperation by existing as an accepted arbiter. His commands were obeyed not because he embodied drastic power, but because resistance to him implied resistance to the will of the metropolis, and by extension, to divine authority. In a precarious environment, such layers of legitimacy simplified disputes and kept the group intact. Yet, there were limits. Colonists were meant to form their own assemblies and magistracies. Autonomy was central to the idea of the apoikiai. The Oikístes provided cohesion and stability during the vulnerable founding phase, but did not exercise indefinite rule. His presence was transitional. He initially established order and served as a symbol thereafter. This balance allowed him to be remembered less as a ruler and more as a civic father, linking memory rather than exercising dominance. The duality of his burden should not be underestimated. Success meant being remembered as a founder, often heroized. Failure meant his name could become a byword for catastrophe. Communities preferred to anchor their fortunes in a single figure, and the Oikístes offered that focal point. His figure elicited gratitude when things went well, and channeled blame if they did not. In either case, he simplified complex histories into a single enduring story, thereby preserving collective memory. It is striking, therefore, how carefully cities managed the appointment process. They understood how much it depended on the role. Civic elites weighed the balance of standing, deciding which man possessed both authority and the ability to leave without destabilizing local politics. Once chosen, he had to fulfill preliminary obligations before assuming leadership. The entire process of colonization was saturated with civic duty and religious solemnity. The founder embodied both but reached full power only when public and divine approval aligned. And so, the founder's path did not lead directly to the sea. First, he had to demonstrate that divine will aligned with human intention. No expedition was mounted without consent from the oracle. For settlers deliberating whether to risk their lives and fortunes, the endorsement of Apollo's voice was crucial. It provided unity where personal judgment might divide into disagreement. Before land was allocated or harbors selected, they relied on words delivered from Parnassus. This is why every tradition of colonization associates the Oikístes with Delphi. In imagination, one can picture him ascending rocky paths, awaiting a pronouncement that would determine whether a city could be established. The authority of the priests and their council turned vision into reality. Once he returned, blessed by Apollo, his leadership carried a weight that no argument could overturn. From that moment, the act of migration had more than a civic purpose. It had divine necessity. Understanding how this process worked brings us to the religious stage that every expedition faced before setting out. The Oikístes did not merely plan routes or persuade followers. He first sought approval at a place where men listened for the gods' reply. And that is where we turn next, to see how the voice of Apollo at Delphi became the loudest authority in guiding Greeks to new homes. The journey of colonization did not pause at the shoreline, but at a mountain. Before settlers could set sail, their leader was expected to stand before Apollo's sanctuary at Delphi. This shrine, nestled on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, was believed to be the very navel of the world, yet its role in colonization was not purely mystical. For a new polis, Delphi provided two crucial things simultaneously: religious sanction and access to Greece's most extensive information network. Only with that seal could an uncertain expedition gain both legitimacy and direction. At the heart of the sanctuary was the Pythia, the woman whose trance-voiced words were interpreted as Apollo speaking. Her utterances could determine whether settlers sailed, stayed, or deemed their chosen site acceptable. Crucially, her responses did not map coastlines in precise detail. More often, they came as yes or no approvals. Settle here, avoid this venture, proceed cautiously. In that simplicity, the oracle offered practical guidance that settlers could act upon, while endowing it with the force of divine will. The workings of Delphi deserve attention because its influence was based on more than inspiration. Pilgrims came from all across the Mediterranean, bringing news of conflicts, harbors, trading partners, and rivalries. Priests and attendants collected these voices, maintaining an unparalleled pool of practical intelligence. When Pythia spoke, her words were shaped by this listening network. To the settlers, they were commands. To us, they resemble an archive of Mediterranean knowledge filtered through the voice of Apollo. That is why her verdict was so significant. Think of Delphi as an ancient intelligence hub veiled in ritual. Merchants passing through provided reports of friendly ports. Travelers described fertile river valleys or coastal dangers. Envoys discussed shifting alliances between polis. Priests, compiling this flow, could distill it into statements delivered as prophecy. The settlers heard Apollo. The process also functioned as a clearinghouse for accumulated data. This dual nature, divine message and practical counsel, explains why expeditions trusted it so completely. And a simple takeaway you can carry with you is this: Delphi did two things. It publicly authorized action, and it privately closed debate. The social impact was as crucial as the information itself. Colonists setting out on a voyage came from diverse backgrounds, including exiles, farmers, and traders. Their motives conflicted, and disputes could delay departure before a sail was raised. However, once their Oikístes returned bearing Apollo's words, the quarrels ceased. To oppose the decision now would not be to argue with a neighbor, but to oppose a god. Even those who might hesitate privately typically submitted in practice. The oracle's seal silenced dissent that no contract or council decree alone could quell. Delphi was not merely an accessory attached to a pre-decided process. Its verdict genuinely mattered. A city could justify its origins by declaring, "We went where Apollo approved." That statement lent the venture weight surpassing any aristocrat's command. One recorded incident recounts men resisting a voyage until their leader returned with Apollo's approval. Once it was read aloud, no one objected. This authority was powerful, not because of threats, but because it aligned collective action with a higher necessity. For the settlers, this reassurance extended into the voyage itself. Hunger on shipboard, storms battering the sea, these could swiftly diminish resolve. With Delphi's backing, hardships were reframed. Setbacks became tests. Dangers became trials within Apollo's plan. Faith gave form to suffering, enabling settlers to endure without succumbing to despair. Prophecy thus served as morale, keeping fragile crews focused on the destination rather than fear. It is also important to emphasize how formalized this consultation process was. The Oikístes did not simply ask a question and depart. Fees were paid, sacrifices laid upon the altars, rituals performed step by step. These actions signified that the expedition had already commenced in sacred order before anyone left home. Settlers carried not only spoken words, but the memory of standing together in Apollo's presence. It was a collective initiation, framing the founding as destiny rather than mere risk. Even so, divine words could not in themselves sustain civic order once landfall was reached. The oracle answered broad questions, whether to sail, whether to build, but it did not allocate plots, set markets, or decide authority. Colonists required frameworks to address their daily needs, which were established in advance. Without them, disputes would explode. Prophecy created unity. Rules created function. Only together could they hold a polis. Here is the balance. The sanction of the oracle suppressed dissent by placing departure under divine command. The charter ensured the distribution of rights, obligations, and land was fair. Prophecy gave purpose, institutions gave stability. Remove one half of the partnership, and you had either quarreling households or obedient yet unorganized followers. With both intact, settlers became a civic body strong enough to endure. Refusing Delphi was never an option. To set out without Apollo's blessing risked more than bad weather. It risked leaving under a curse, fracturing belief before the ship touched water. Every city that raised colonists went to the mountain first, because to ignore Delphi was to cut away the shared ground of trust. The ritual was not an optional ceremony. It was an obligatory foundation, recognized by all. Neutrality made Delphi's authority even firmer. Multiple polis consulted the sanctuary for various purposes. That very breadth kept Apollo's word from being dismissed as one city's manipulation. A verdict in favor of a colony had weight precisely because it echoed from a shrine open to all Greeks. The Oikístes left with approval not stamped by faction, but by a god judged impartial. In this way, Delphi presents itself less as a fragment of superstition and more as an institution of stability. It absorbed information, reissued it in ritual form, and allowed cities to explain their foundation not as a disorderly migration, but as a divine plan. Citizens later could trace their settlement to a moment when Apollo had spoken clearly. That moment removed future doubt. No one could later claim they had never consented. Consent was collective, bound in sacred time. The real work of colonization happened afterwards. Ships were built, harbors navigated, and first shelters raised. But beneath those actions lay the conviction that Apollo himself had set the path. That conviction acted like an anchor, not iron in the sea, but belief rooting courage against despair. The expedition might fail by hunger or sword, but never by indecision or hesitation. Delphi had already decided. Still, settlers needed more than a decision to survive. They had to establish concrete rules of life the moment their feet touched foreign ground. Divine assurance was a unifying force, but farms had to be surveyed, plots assigned, obligations defined. Without those structures, fragments of trust could unravel into rivalry. And here is where the next stage became unavoidable: the writing of a charter that turned approval into lived order before the city itself existed. So once the oracle's seal was secured, the question reverted to the people themselves. What rules would govern them? Who would own which field? Which powers would magistrates wield? These choices had to be settled in advance, or conflict would undo everything the sanction had secured. The next critical act of founding was therefore not about ships or temples, but about words, the charter that gave a new city its life. For the Greeks, the next essential step after receiving Apollo's sanction was drafting what we might call the charter of a new life. This wasn't an afterthought or a set of rules improvised once they landed. It was the framework of the community, agreed upon before the first sail was raised. Think of it as a promise made to every settler before they left. The charter specified exactly how much land each person would receive, outlined the shape of political authority, and described which rights and responsibilities every colonist would carry into the new world. You, as a would-be settler, knew your plot in advance, your place in the civic body, and how decisions would be made once you reached your destination. That knowledge transformed a risky gamble into a structured chance at survival. Why was this so crucial? Because without rules, the expedition would fall apart the moment settlers touched shore. Picture it: two families stepping off a ship and claiming the same fertile strip of land by a stream. If no agreement existed, they would argue, drag in neighbors, and perhaps fight until the entire party fractured. The charter prevented exactly that. Arguments might still arise, but now there was a written decision that every family had already accepted before departure. These pre-arranged rules acted as a safeguard. They locked order into the colony at its very weakest point, when nothing material had yet been built. Rather than confront disputes with force in the moment, the settlers carried a ready-made solution. The charter provided them with certainty ahead of time, and in doing so, created stability when they needed it most. The strongest part of this charter was the promise of land allotment. Everyone signed with a clear expectation: this plot will be yours, distributed fairly, rather than taken or stolen by the strongest when they arrive. The promise of land was the most significant incentive to join, and it was written down so no farmer risked being left empty-handed. For many families, land was the only reason they would consider such a risky journey. But the charter went further. It also explained what kind of government the colony would have. Would authority rest with a council of citizens, elected magistrates, or an assembly where everyone had a voice? How much initial power would the Oikístes hold before handing control over to the community? These questions mattered greatly, and the charter provided at least an initial arrangement. Colonists continued to debate and make changes over time, but the basic setup was already in place. That sense of order made taking risks feel shared. You might be leaving behind home, extended family, and familiar gods, but the charter reassured you that life in the new polis wouldn't be lawless. It provided certainty about your role as a citizen, what duties you owed, how disputes would be resolved, and where your rights began and ended. Without such clarity, many would have been discouraged from volunteering altogether. In fact, The charter was as much a recruitment tool as a constitution. It convinced hesitant families that they would not be cheated once abroad. No aristocrat could claim the best lands for themselves because all plots had already been marked out. That promise gave confidence to those considering risking everything on the voyage. Without it, suspicion would have kept potential settlers at home. This balance was also intended to prevent exploitation. In an unregulated environment, the wealthy or powerful could dominate, taking the best land and forcing others into a state of dependence. A pre-written charter prevented those opportunities from the outset. It did not eliminate the potential for inequality to develop later, but it provided settlers with a fairer start. This breathing space was often enough for the colony to stabilize before larger conflicts arose. The significance of fairness also influenced the field of psychology. Imagine choosing to leave your homeland with nothing guaranteed except promises whispered by charismatic leaders. Few would accept. Now compare that to hearing an Oikístes read aloud a charter that explained your rights in the new city. Suddenly, you had something to measure the risks against. Fixed land, shared rights, a clear system of governance. It felt less like abandonment and more like joining a defined project. Settlers carried this reassurance with them across the sea. When hardship struck, they could turn back to the charter to resolve disputes. Arguments over land, power, or obligations no longer went on endlessly because the community shared a common reference point. That is why the charter was often regarded alongside the founder's authority and Apollo's sanction as the trinity of legitimacy. Each supported the other, shielding the entire enterprise with a sense of order. What particularly stands out is the extent of planning involved. These away homes were not reckless mobs of exiles. They were well-prepared, deliberate ventures, carefully modeled in detail before the first huts appeared. You could say the charter was the city's framework, laid down before flesh appeared on its bones. The colony existed in thought before it materialized in stone. When quarrels did erupt and human nature made them inevitable, the charter mediated them. Settlers did not need to invent justice on the spot. They carried something like a civic anchor, proof that their rights existed independently of current anger. A neighbor might be bitter over pastures, but the resolution had already been settled months before. Knowing that is what allowed a community of strangers to face hardship without splitting apart. Colonization was never free of conflict. Drought, disease, and clashes with local populations. None of these could be anticipated in advance. But charters removed the one danger that could destroy a colony before it began: settlers turning against each other over property and status. The framework lessened that vulnerability, buying time to survive and develop into a proper polis. This sequence reveals something important. Colonization always followed a pattern. Apollo's word first, then civic agreement through the charter, then physical departure. That is why the process lasted for generations. Each new settlement was based on the same sequence: a god's sanction, a founder's leadership, and a charter's promise. With those in place, colonization became a repeatable act rather than a reckless experiment. Nevertheless, a charter was only as effective as the people willing to uphold it. Without living bodies to till the soil, build houses, and defend walls, the document was powerless. That meant recruitment was the most significant challenge. Convincing people to leave everything familiar required more than just words on parchment. Settlers needed to be persuaded face to face in spaces large enough to attract men from across the Greek world. And so the Oikístes sought out audiences already assembled, places where Greeks gathered in vast numbers, eager for prestige and recognition. Recruitment was most effective when the entire community came together, and ambition was already evident. Charter in hand, settlers knew what they were promised, and that promise sold the voyage. The next step was to find those willing to stake their lives on it. Imagine the stadium at Olympia as dust rises from a wrestling match, the crowd pressing in, voices lifted in praise. Amid the spectacle, another figure takes his chance, the Oikístes, calling not just for athletes, but for volunteers to settle a city across the sea. Athletic displays and colonization meet in the exact moment, the spectacle of victory providing the stage for recruitment. For a Greek founder, the games were not a sideshow, but the best venue to recruit the lifeblood of a polis, the farmers, soldiers, and artisans who could transform wilderness into a community. Colonies demanded more than divine sanction or legal frameworks. They required hands that could till the soil, erect walls, and defend against foes. No charter could raise crops without a farmer, and no promise of order could protect itself against threats without warriors. The new settlement's very existence depended on persuading men to take the voyage, and such persuasion could not be left to one city alone. When local volunteers proved insufficient, recruitment shifted to where the largest audiences gathered. That is why the great Pan-Hellenic festivals became pivotal. Here, at Olympia, Isthmia near Corinth, Nemea in the Peloponnese, and Delphi with its Pythian contests, Greeks came together from distant valleys, rival coasts, and inland plains. These games drew the scattered threads of the Hellenic world into one temporary setting. For the Oikístes, this was an unparalleled opportunity. In a single place, he could reach a mix of men who would otherwise never stand side by side: warriors, farmers, younger sons without inheritances, men willing to risk themselves for gain. The scene is not difficult to picture. The crowd disperses after a hard-fought race. Incense still drifts from sacrifices made at a nearby altar. Against that backdrop, a man of standing lifts his voice with an appeal, not for victory, but for courage of a different kind. He speaks of farmland waiting overseas, of plots guaranteed by charter, and of status available to second sons who are otherwise excluded at home. He names opportunity, roots it in civic order, and presents it as a collective venture sanctified by Apollo's will. Recruitment often occurred in this manner, publicly, within the sacred spaces of Pan-Hellenic festivals. The prestige of the games heightened the call. These were not ordinary gatherings. They honored gods through athletic excellence. To announce a colony in that setting cast the project in a similar light, less like a personal venture, more like a communal offering aligned with divine and civic duty. For the audience, hearing recruitment framed in the language of piety eased the fear of risk. To join became not only opportunistic, but also honorable, a step woven into the fabric of religious and cultural life. The reason was as much practical as symbolic. When a metropolis drew too few volunteers from its own citizenry, the festivals provided a broader pool of talent. The crowds were already assembled, hundreds and thousands of Greeks united in an atmosphere of pride and identity. There was no better opportunity to make the pitch. The words spoken there might turn hesitation into resolve, as men who had cheered athletes for glory now contemplated risking themselves for land and legacy. At festivals, psychology is combined with promise. Athletes push their bodies to the limit, with wreaths and fame as their reward. Watching them, a Greek spectator already felt the weight of sacrifice, of risk exchanged for honor. When the Oikístes stood nearby, offering land and status for the same willingness to risk, the leap did not seem so vast. Personal danger was reinterpreted within the same mental framework as athletic triumph. Endurance now pledged civic legacy rather than olive crowns. For the settler weighing his options, this was a significant development. He might recall that staying at home was safer in the short term, but it left him with too little land, no inheritance, and estrangement from his polis. To depart was dangerous, but to depart framed as service, opportunity, and a God-endorsed act of courage suddenly appeared feasible. The recruitment scene at the Games encapsulated all these factors into one public occasion to decide. The sacred setting amplified the effect. Because the contests were sacrifices to gods expressed through competition, the invitation to join a colony drew sympathy from that context. Colonization was narrated not as exile or desperate flight, but as the founding of a polis within the same cultural and religious arc as winning a race or throwing a javelin. Such framing eased the transition from the known to the unknown. This was the key advantage of recruitment at festivals. It allowed Oikístes to turn an abstract plan into a tangible invitation, spoken publicly, dressed in the legitimacy of religion, and carried along with shared pride. Amid the applause of a pan-Hellenic crowd, the call was not a private deal, but a civic proclamation. That resonance gave power to words that might otherwise waver. For many listeners, the message also addressed immediate needs. Farmers saw a route to land they could never secure at home. Younger sons saw an escape from the shadow of their elder brothers. Traders saw markets on routes still unfamiliar. Exiles saw safety from political rivals. Speaking during the shared moment of the Games, the Oikístes reached all these audiences simultaneously. Few settings could unite such diverse motives into a single message. The result was practical. The Oikístes, who had struggled to fill his roster locally, left, gathering volunteers from many cities. Risk remained. Fear remained. But the bodies were there, ready to build huts, till the soil, and defend the walls. Without this, the charter and Apollo's approval would be mere paper and smoke. With it, they became living settlements. We should not overlook what this signifies for the pattern of colonization. Athletic festivals gave colonization its human heart, just as charters provided it with order, and Delphi bestowed it with sanction. Collectively, they ensured expeditions could transform from idea to reality. The Games offered the one resource only collective gatherings could provide: willing men ready to try. From crowds pressed together under the sun and dust, groups emerged that boarded ships, carrying both hope and uncertainty. And from their choices, cities grew, often autonomous, sometimes loyal, sometimes rivalrous. Their independence made colonization more than just expansion. It was a double act, rooted in the memory of the metropolis, yet charting its own course across the sea. That tension persists with us. Colonies were created as independent from the outset, yet they always remembered their origins. The promise shouted out at a festival might unite men into a new community, but it also bore the name of the city that sent them. Over time, these ties could support, strain, or break, depending on circumstances. The question of how these bonds endure or fail begins where recruitment ends. If colonies gained independence, what did they still owe their mother cities? The answer lies in a web of bonds that are both symbolic and practical. These connections mattered, even without daily control. Colonists honored the gods they brought from across the sea, kept festivals aligned with their origins, and remembered their founder as if he were a civic ancestor. Such gestures were less about law and more about memory. a reminder that new cities had roots in older soil. Think of it as a family tree, each branch growing outward, yet still connected to the same trunk. But this was never a uniform pattern. Geography and circumstances shaped each case differently, and autonomy meant colonies acted as they saw fit. They could revere the metropolis in rituals while simultaneously resisting its interests. What persisted was tension. The relationship was partly kinship, partly rivalry, and always subject to choice. Typically, mother cities would offer help or make gestures of solidarity if it aligned with their own interests. But colonies remained autonomous, constantly weighing obligations against their own survival. Syracuse demonstrates this balance clearly. Founded by Corinth, it grew into one of the greatest powers of the Western Greek world. During crises, Syracuse relied on Corinth for support, recognizing that kinship could still provide aid when needed. The exchange demonstrates how bonds can still retain value across centuries. Yet Syracuse was never a subordinate outpost. It fought its own wars, expanded into new territory, and pursued foreign policy independently. It was amicable to Corinth when friendship was advantageous, not because it was obliged to be. The tie was remembered in cult and commerce, but Syracuse's guiding principle was its independence. Potidaea illustrates another side of the spectrum. Unlike Syracuse, it was under closer supervision by Corinth. The metropolis periodically appointed magistrates to Potidaea, maintaining formal influence over its affairs. This level of oversight was exceptional and made Potidaea a rare case of closer alignment, more like a younger sibling willingly deferring to an elder. Even here, the colony was not a province. It retained its own civic identity. But the presence of Corinthian officials suggests that oversight could become closer when both sides agreed it was beneficial. At the opposite end stood Corcyra. From early on, its relationship with Corinth was hostile. Naval battles marked its history, and disputes flared regularly. Every century or so, new conflicts erupted, culminating in the well-known quarrel that helped spark the Peloponnesian War. Here, kinship only intensified hostility. Corcyra did not cut ties peacefully. It resisted through open violence. Shared ancestry became not a bond, but a wound that both cities reopened across generations. Syracuse, Potidaea, Corcyra, three names illustrating the range of possibilities. One cooperative yet independent, one unusually compliant, one persistently hostile. These were not exceptions, but signals of the system's inherent flexibility. Colonies did not follow a single model. Their ties were as adaptable as family bonds, sometimes supportive, sometimes deferential, occasionally antagonistic, always remembered, never entirely erased. Economic ties also linked them. Colonies exported resources that the Greek mainland could not produce easily in large quantities: grain from fertile plains, metals from mines, timber from distant forests. In return, mother cities provided goods such as pottery, oil, and wine. These exchanges fostered trade and habits of interaction. Yet, loyalty was pragmatic. If trade remained profitable, ties persisted. If it declined, relationships cooled. A colony could sever links without hesitation if it gained an advantage elsewhere. Obligations, then, were situational. A colony might seek aid when under threat, and the mother city might respond if it saw benefit or prestige. Potidaea's compliance was driven by convenience. Syracuse's cooperation reflected moments of shared necessity. Corcyra saw only rivalry. None of this was driven by unconditional devotion. Each polis calculated, adapted, and acted, prioritizing its own benefit. For colonies, this made sense. These were communities that had left everything behind, braved seas, and fought to survive on foreign soil. Their legitimacy stemmed from founding rituals, the Oikístes, the Charter, the Oracle, not ongoing oversight. They naturally defended their hard-won ground as their own. Autonomy was non-negotiable. Ties to the metropolis persisted only where they proved helpful. For mother cities, the return was partly about prestige. Being a metropolis meant more than just practical trade. It was about glory, the lasting recognition that a town had extended Hellenism abroad. Corinth could see Syracuse, Potidaea, and Corcyra as its creations, regardless of how their later paths diverged. Each colony reflected honor, reminding others that Corinth ranked among the leading organizers of expansion. Prestige endured even when obedience had waned. That is why the family analogy remains useful, if used sparingly. Families quarrel or even fall into a feud, but the shared name endures. Similarly, colonies might reject, resist, or ally with their metropolis, but they could not erase their origin story. The label of Mother City remained significant, with weight regardless of how the practical relationship evolved. And still, colonies maintained recognition through ritual gestures tied to their origins. Even when politically autonomous, they might send symbolic offerings, honor a festival, or preserve the founder's memory. These customs safeguarded their identity from dislocation. They might be free cities, but they remained recognizably Greek, rooted in a chain of inheritance. This cultural memory was as vital as any trade goods they carried. The boundaries of the system were clear. When rivalry surpassed family bonds, conflict arose. The wars ignited by Corcyra and Corinth illustrate the destructive potential of such divisions. However, the enduring presence of other, more cooperative connections shows that the model was resilient. Colonization did not demand permanent loyalty. It required enough kinship to preserve identity and sufficient independence to maintain self-rule. These conditions proved to be enduring for centuries. Geography formed the foundation of it all. Greece itself was fragmented, valleys separated by mountains, communities divided by sea. Colonization expanded this naturally dispersed pattern outward. Colonies appeared as dots along distant coasts, each too far to govern daily, yet close enough for shared memory to bridge the gaps. The sea routes enabled connection. The vast distances enforced autonomy. Autonomy and kinship existed in harmony because geography made them inevitable. The outcome was a Mediterranean map more like a web than a singular territory. Settlements sparkled like beads strung along coasts. Some beads were close, linked by rituals and shared memories with their metropolis. Others drifted far away, still marked by ancestry, but kept at arm's length. The structure was loose, but that looseness was its strength. It allowed the system to adapt, grow, and endure long after political alliances changed. No polis was ever governed like a province under Rome. Instead, ties were built through ritual gestures, cultural kinship, and occasional calls for aid or trade. Colonies operated as independent states. Mother cities enjoyed prestige, and the entire structure was held together not by empire, but by memory and mutual interest. Fragile at the edges, yet resilient in practice. This arrangement also defined identity. Colonists abroad could still trace back to an original homeland for legitimacy, maintaining a shared Hellenic culture even on foreign shores. That claim of origin set them apart from strangers, making them part of a distant but coherent Greek world. There was opportunity and risk in this system. It allowed Greek life to spread without central authority, but it also meant disputes could escalate into wars that shook alliances across the Aegean. Yet this flexibility was precisely why it endured. Colonization depended on bonds that could stretch rather than break. For the mother city, recognition and prestige made the effort worthwhile. For the colony, independence and identity provided the basis for survival. Both benefited, but were always driven by self-interest rather than unquestioning loyalty. And when circumstances shifted, ties were renegotiated, forgotten, or reignited all over again. So when you step back, what you observe is a loose yet enduring pattern. Colonies, independent yet not rootless, and metropoles, proud but not dominant. The system balanced autonomy with kinship, rivalry with memory. It created a fractured yet connected world that reshaped the map of the Mediterranean. And from those bonds, fragile and adaptable, emerged a broader geography of Greek settlement, one that spread along coasts and influenced the very pattern of Greek life abroad. Trace a Greek ship's course, and you begin to see a network take shape. From the Aegean outward, voyages spread dots of settlement which, when connected, outline the world the Greeks constructed. These journeys were not random. They followed deliberate patterns, choosing coasts with harbors, land, and opportunity, while avoiding shores held by stronger powers. Drawing the map of colonization involves tracing these choices as they spread across the Mediterranean and beyond. The first area to examine is near home. By the early first millennium, the Aegean islands were already settled by Greeks expanding after the fall of the Mycenaean civilization. By the 8th century BC, the coast of Asia Minor, particularly its western shore, was dotted with Greek cities. For a settler, this coast felt more like a continuation of home than foreign territory. Narrow seas made crossing straightforward. Culture and language were familiar. This was the initial belt of colonies, closely linked to the Aegean core. Expansion then moved northward. Along the Thracian coast and parts of Thessaly, fertile plains and dense forests offered what the limited land at home could not. The sea teemed with fish, and inland routes led to grain fields. Colonies formed a nearly complete circle around the Aegean, so much so that an ancient thinker compared the Greeks to frogs gathered around a pond. This imagery perfectly reflects the map. An almost unbroken ring of coastal settlements transformed the Aegean from a frontier sea into the center of their collective geography. Further north was the challenge and opportunity of the Black Sea. This was a more distant and complex region, and its eastern shores remained unfriendly territory in the eyes of the Greeks. However, along its edges, Crimea to the north and the southern coast of modern Turkey, Greeks established lasting cities. One was Trapezois. Another was the settlement that would become Sebastopol. In these remote outposts, Greeks traded grain, metal, and fish, integrating these formidable waters into their broader economic network. Although the Black Sea was never entirely subdued, its borders offered enough for Greek interests to justify the risk. Turn south and east, and the landscape changes markedly. Powerful empires already dominated the coastlines of Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon. Assyria, Persia, and their predecessors held firm in fertile valleys and ancient cities. Here, Greek ships could sail but not conquer. Established states blocked every inlet. Colonies did not land there because they were unable to do so. Egypt was the notable exception. In the Nile Delta stood Naucratis, a trading post established not by Greek settlers, but by the pharaoh. It was unique for its time, as it existed by treaty and permission, rather than colonization in the usual sense. Here, Greeks operated under Egyptian oversight, allowed to trade, but unable to claim land or autonomy. Naucratis symbolizes the eastern edge of the map, one small outpost in a world essentially closed to colonization. The reasoning becomes clearer if you think of water flowing over stone. Liquid moves where there are gaps, fills hollows, and turns channels into streams. Where rock blocks its way, it cannot go. Greek colonization spread similarly. Weakly held coasts invited settlement. Strong empires and rivals stood as barriers. The Aegean Islands, Asia Minor, and Thrace were easily accessible. The Black Sea allowed partial access. The Levant and Egypt resisted, except in one carefully managed niche. When you shift the map west, a second homeland of settlements appears. Southern Italy and Sicily drew large numbers of Greeks. So many cities thrived there that the region earned its own identity as Magna Graecia. Great Greece. Temples rose on Sicilian coasts, markets buzzed in Calabrian harbors, and Greek speech and customs dominated entire stretches of shoreline. If colonization began as an escape from pressure, here it became a means of creating a parallel cultural center. Still, the settlers showed the same preference. They clung to coastlines. Harbors provided access to trade routes, lifelines for supplies, and quick connections back to the Aegean. Inland areas remained sparsely settled. The rugged hills and native populations of Sicily's interior were not attractive to Greek colonists, so they largely stayed outward-facing, anchored to the sea. Simply put, the Greeks were a seafaring people. They valued trade and the mobility that a coastline offered, and rarely invested in settlements away from salt water unless compelled. But Western expansion also faced opposition. Carthage, a Phoenician colony itself, became the main barrier to Greek ambitions. Its control of North Africa, dominance of Western Sicily, and naval strength forced the Greeks into competition. The struggle between Syracuse and Carthage became legendary, turning Sicily into a constant battleground. As with the Levant, the rule remained. Powerful states blocked colonization. Greek settlements only took root where pressure eased. In Italy, the south was filled with polis, but the north drew a firm line. The Etruscans proved formidable, retaining their lands and denying easy access for Greek expansion. The Riviera and central zones remained out of reach for the Greeks. Again, the frontier was determined not by desire, but by strength. Colonization progressed where opportunities arose and halted where rivals were strongest. The farthest west that the Greeks carried their influence was not just into Sicily and Italy, but even further. On the coast of what is now France, they founded Massilia, modern Marseille. Even farther into Spain, Greek traders and occasional settlers established scattered outposts. These cities were few, but vital. Each served as a gateway into routes transporting metals and goods eastward. The westward reach demonstrates how extensive the network could be when rivals, such as Carthage or Etruscan powers, left occasional gaps. To understand who made this possible, you can look back to the leading colonizing powers. Miletus, Corinth, Megara, Chalcis, and Eretria stand out as some of the most active parent cities. Each dispatched expeditions, approved Oikístes, and launched settlements that spread the Greek world thousands of kilometers wider. Their role shows that colonization was not equally driven from every Greek city. Particular metropolies had the ambition, resources, and connections to project themselves abroad. The results formed a pattern that was both consistent and uneven. Consistent because the logic was straightforward. Opportunity, not conquest, drew settlers. Uneven because geography and politics dictated where those opportunities existed. That is why southern Italy was full of Greek polis, while the Levant was devoid of them. Why Black Sea fringes held dozens of settlements, while inland Europe did not. Opportunity combined with access to the sea, these were the threads weaving the map. Together, these colonies transformed the Mediterranean. They turned the coasts into a chain of ports where Greek ways of life were preserved and shared. Each was autonomous, but each also bore Hellenic features recognizable to travelers: language, gods, coins, laws. The spread built not an empire, but a shared space, akin to a necklace of beads around shared waters. The consequences of this map extended beyond its geographical boundaries. Magna Graecia became a cultural peer of mainland Greece. Black Sea polis, with their grain exports, turned into vital links to sustain homeland populations. Massilia opened routes into Central European trade. Naucratis anchored interactions with Egypt. Each site, in its own way, connected outward, while still maintaining ties to the Aegean. Colonization was a spatial endeavor, but it was also a network deeply rooted in exchange. By the time you examine the Mediterranean in its entirety, the pattern becomes clear. Greeks did not wander. They followed routes shaped by a simple rule. Geography and local power determined where they could go. Where coasts were accessible and neighbors were weak enough, polis established themselves. Where rivals or empires remained strong, ships simply passed by. Geography, combined with local influences, creates a map of settlement. Once this map was established, the movement of goods began to follow it. Colonies linked raw materials from the Black Sea, grains from Sicily, and metals from Iberia back to Aegean markets. Trade developed along the very routes outlined by these expansions. What appears on the map of settlements soon became the framework of a trading system, carrying goods, wealth, and influence across Mediterranean waters. From here, we can shift focus from geography to its daily effects. What did these networks mean for families, farmers, and artisans in Greece? A Greek pot found in Spain, or a Spanish metal melted down in Athens. Such exchanges show that colonization was about more than just land. It was about creating a shared economy. This economy would fundamentally change Greek society from the ground up. A single amphora from a Greek potter discovered in Spain and silver from Iberia, which reappears in Athens, reveal more than just individual exchanges. It indicates a system, a shared Mediterranean economy that developed through colonization. The very act of establishing polis abroad created trading links that connected distant coasts into one network. Living at that time meant seeing your world expand beyond your valley or island and witnessing new patterns of wealth and connection form around you. Each new colony served as a knot that linked coasts together. Grain from Sicily's fertile plains, metals mined in Iberia, or wines cultivated along Italian hills arrived in Aegean harbors. Goods also moved outward. Olive oil, pottery, and crafted wares entered foreign markets. The result was integration. Where once polis were fragmented local economies, they now formed a vibrant trading web stretching across hundreds of miles. You would not only harvest from your soil, but also draw from distant fields. This expansion changed the foundations of Greek economics. For centuries, power meant control of vast tracts of farmland. Aristocrats owning large estates dominated society because they controlled the food supply. Colonization shifted that balance. Grain imported from colonies lessened dependence on native yields. Metals and manufactured goods created new opportunities for wealth. Artisans, merchants, and shipbuilders gained prominence as their work found markets abroad. Wealth began to flow through professions outside aristocratic estates. This circulation of goods created room for new social classes. Traders navigated routes between colonies, buying cheaply and selling at a profit. Blacksmiths and potters gained recognition abroad when their wares became sought-after exports. Shipbuilding flourished since every exchange required vessels. The economy no longer limited the opportunity for landowners. The network of colonies opened avenues for profit that could raise talents and ambitions beyond the old aristocratic structures. For Greece, it introduced a level of professional diversity rarely seen before. Harbors were filled with cargo ships, not just fishing boats. Markets began to sell goods whose shapes or flavors hinted at foreign encounters. Alongside prosperity, cultural contact emerged. Imported wines, flavored festivals, and foreign metals-shaped ornaments whose designs showed influences from distant coasts. Colonization was not only about food and minerals, it was about redistributing ideas carried along with goods. Sicily exemplifies this shift more clearly. Its abundant grain harvests made it a true granary for many mother polis. When poor weather affected Greece itself, Sicilian exports could support survival. Ships carried wheat and barley across the Ionian, helping households avoid famine. Colonization thus expanded choice and provided security. For the first time, a polis could buffer a bad season with imports instead of falling into scarcity. Economic change is also reflected in political life. Aristocrats had long claimed that their dominance was natural because their land sustained the city. But as survival increasingly relied on imported grain and circulating wealth, others could also point to their contributions. Traders, artisans, and especially citizen farmers who armed themselves as hoplites demanded a greater voice in the government. Their economic influence, combined with their role in military defense, became a form of leverage. This alliance of wealth and armed strength expanded the political stage. It is essential to maintain perspective. Colonization did not directly create democracy. However, it did promote trade, distribute wealth, and weaken the exclusive control of aristocratic elites. These changes broadened the level of influence, and once expanded, voices could demand recognition. Colonization should be viewed as a significant factor in economic diversification and political transformation, not as a single cause. The evidence from markets shows how systemic the shift was. As goods circulated more widely, the need for shared standards became clear. Agreed weights and measures began to spread, easing exchanges across harbors that might otherwise have been slowed by confusion. Over time, monetary exchange evolved. However, coinage itself appears slightly later and is debated among scholars. What matters here is not whether coins jingled in early markets, but that colonization pressed communities towards standard systems that streamlined trade. For you, as an ordinary Greek, the change would have been visible. Where once trade fairs had been modest, now foreign goods appeared regularly. Pottery was produced not just for neighborly transactions, but for export. Shipbuilding yards clattered with work. A farmer with modest land could supplement his life through trade or service abroad. Colonization expanded not only horizons, but options. At the same time, this widening created competition and jealousy. Aristocrats resisted losing primacy, yet their monopoly had been broken. The polis had more sources of wealth, and with them came more claims to influence. Tyrannies and reforms in the 7th and 6th centuries emerged from these fractures between old dominance and new ambition. Colonization had fueled the economy, making struggles over power sharper. Hoplitic warfare makes the connection clear. By spreading wealth below the aristocracy and making equipment affordable, colonization allowed middle farmers to stand in phalanx formations. Warfare then was not the privilege of a few equestrians, but the discipline of many shield-bearing men. In council, these men argued, if we fight and die as citizens, should we not deliberate as citizens too? Colonization had not created the claim, but it had strengthened it beyond denial. The pattern also strengthened resilience. Grain from Sicily or the Black Sea reduced dependence on local rainfall. Metal routes supplied raw materials for tools and armor. Workshops flourished. The more strands the economy added, the less a single failure could cause a collapse. Colonization encouraged diversification, which in turn gave Greek society stability alongside dynamism. For many individuals, it meant both escape and opportunity. Farmers pressed by land division at home could try their fortunes abroad. Artisans with skill could reach new markets. Exiles could rebuild reputations and wealth in distant settlements. Colonization not only provided relief from overcrowded valleys, it channeled ambition and dissatisfaction into outlets that strengthened the whole system. This is why some compare it to a frontier model, a release valve where tension turned into expansion rather than rupture. Step back, and you see colonization as an economic accelerator. It built networks that broadened wealth across society. It shifted influence away from strict land ownership and gave more citizens grounds to seek recognition. It promoted resilience and diversity. In practice, it linked scattered valleys into a shared world connected by ships, trust, and trade. For the Greeks themselves, this was not explained in theoretical terms. They justified foundations through ritual, the sanction of Apollo, the charter of rights, the leader chosen to embody legitimacy. The economy grew from those acts, yet its binding memory resided in the people who first carried it forward. That memory ensured trust, stability, and identity persisted even amid change. So, beneath the flow of grain, metals, wine, and oil, there also ran the memory of authority. Colonies could not rely solely on trade to hold them together. They leaned on shared stories of origin, and at the heart of every origin stood one figure whose role endured across generations, long after his death. Long after the Oikístes had gone, his presence remained central to civic life. The founder was honored not only as a leader of the past, but as an ancestor woven into the fabric of everyday ritual. His shrine or tomb became a place where citizens gathered, offered sacrifices, and reflected on their origins. These were not private remembrances, they were public acts of religion. Founder cults were real civic rituals, as binding as any festival to Zeus or Apollo, and they gave the city a shared sense of continuity. Why did this matter so much? Because colonies were fragile, survival often seemed uncertain. To remember the founder was to celebrate the fact that the polis still stood. His authority had overseen the division of fields, the writing of the charter, and the sanction of the oracle. He had turned fear and disorder into a viable civic framework. By treating him as a hero in death, citizens affirmed that order had triumphed over chaos and that their inheritance was secure. The fact that many Oikístes were men of living memory only makes this more remarkable. These were not remote kings of myth or shadowy figures of antiquity. They were recent leaders, sometimes even known personally to the older members of the community. Yet over time, they became transformed into something more, half hero, half ancestor. Their humanity did not lessen their authority. Instead, it made the ritual all the more convincing. Citizens could point to a name they knew and say, we are here because of him. The reason lies in what the founder cults achieved. They turned political legitimacy into ritual memory. A polis did not endure simply because agreements were written or commands enforced. Agreements could be broken and commands ignored. But if legitimacy was sanctified through ceremony, it became embedded in the collective imagination. When citizens sacrificed in honor of the Oikístes, they acted out loyalty to the founding moment itself. Memory became civic glue, binding people across divides of class, interest, or origin. This practice explained why Greek colonies lasted beyond immediate conflicts. Mere force could hold a settlement together temporarily, but it collapsed once disputes intensified. Faith in the founder's role, however, provided the community with a lasting anchor. His shrine was not about glorifying one man's ambition. It was about maintaining unity. Even amidst quarrels, citizens could look back to the exact figure as the root of their civic family. The analogy of household ancestry was clear to the Greeks. Families drew strength from honoring forebears through shrines and rituals. Colonies did the same on a civic level. The Oikístes was remembered as the symbolic father of the entire community, transforming unrelated settlers into members of a shared civic household. By calling him ancestor, they granted kinship where little else connected them. In distant lands, this memory became even more essential. Colonists lived apart from their mother city, surrounded by strangers, unfamiliar customs, and competing powers. The founder cult anchored them in Greek identity. By recalling his journey, his authority, and his origins in Greece, they reaffirmed that they were not exiles, but rightful heirs to tradition abroad. The shrine of the founder stitched cultural identity into the new land, preventing it from drifting into foreignness. Imagine the scene at one of these rites. Citizens gather before a stone marker or small temple, offering wheat, wine, or incense as an act of worship. Stories of the voyage and the founding are rehearsed. Children learn how their city's order began, while elders nod, recalling the lives of those who first crossed the sea. Each time the story is told, the polis is reborn. The founder's cult was not nostalgia. It was renewal, proof that legitimacy was a continuous process. The practice also served as a safety net during times of stress. Colonies were diverse, comprising exiles, sons without inheritance, and merchants seeking new markets. Pressure could cause division. However, the cult of the Oikístes created a meeting point that transcended factional rivalry. Acknowledging him was to acknowledge shared identity. The ritual reminded everyone, whether rich or poor, that they shared a symbolic parent and, therefore, a civic body. Situated alongside the worship of gods, the founder sat within a dual system of legitimacy. Temples and rites to Olympian deities consecrated divine favor. The founder cult consecrated human origin. Both were crucial. Together, they formed a civic order based on faith as much as law. Without either, the polis faced collapse. Religion and memory were not extras. They were fundamental structures of human experience. The cult also reached outward, back to the metropolis. Honoring the founder implicitly honored the city that had chosen him. His shrine reminded colonists of their roots. Sacrificing at Corinth's appointed founder in Syracuse, for example, acknowledged Corinth's role without relinquishing political control. These echoes linked the colonies to a broader world of Hellenism. They enabled independence and cultural belonging to coexist. This is why Greek colonization never disintegrated into separate settlements. Ritual connections united the territory, even when political bonds weakened. Colonies might quarrel with their metropolis, or even go to war, yet remain within the same cultural sphere. Shared founders, gods, and rituals ensured a recognizable Hellenic world. The real innovation here was what the Greeks understood about legitimacy. Conquest might take land, but only ritual could make it last. By embedding their origins in memory and imbuing them with sacredness, they secured their survival in the imagination of future generations. Without the founder cult, a colony risked being seen as a mere camp of migrants. With it, it became a polis, a community rooted in place and permanence. So, the cult of the Oikístes did far more than honor an individual. It transformed the act of founding into a ritual memory, turned history into civic unity, and ensured that order persisted beyond the first generation. Each shrine was a civic anchor, as vital as a temple or council chamber. Each offering represented a renewed acceptance that the land was theirs by right, not by chance. When you set this alongside the charter and the oracle's approval, the triad of legitimacy becomes clear. The polis abroad was not a drifting improvisation. It was a deliberate creation, fortified with law, divine sanction, and civic lineage. Each colony could adapt to local stresses, but with those three elements in place, it stood on solid ground. Every colony repeated the same pattern, sanctioned by Apollo, organized through a charter, sustained through the cult of the founder. This rhythm was the unseen architecture behind the spread of Greek life. Colonization succeeded because it comprised these reliable parts, repeated time and again, offering predictability and coherence amid risk. That is why the Greeks were able to establish a network of cities across the Mediterranean without establishing an empire. They expanded not through orders, but through patterns, embedding memory and legitimacy into each new settlement. Colonization succeeded not only because people moved, but because they remembered how they had moved. At its core, the founder cult shows that history was not abandoned. It was kept alive through ritual. People lived in the present, yet continually reenacted their origins in public ceremonies. The future was stabilized by repeating the past. When settlers made sacrifices at the founder's shrine, they were reaffirming the very legitimacy that allowed them to retain the land. From this practice, you can see colonization as something more organized than mere migration. It becomes evident that Greek expansion was not random wandering, but a ritualized process of establishing new worlds. Greek colonization was founded on a pattern that combined belief, order, and adaptation. Each community began with established steps: approval from Apollo, guidance from a chosen founder, and the drafting of a charter, ensuring stability from the moment the voyage commenced. What might have been chaos was instead shaped into enduring cities. Through these settlements, trade expanded, identities spread across the seas, and the Greeks built a shared economy that linked distant coasts. Colonies served as markets, sites of rituals, and experiments in civic life all at once.